20% of their total asset holdings with that one question. We would actually step away from the system that's killing us.
Do you agree that having some sort of indemnification against a premature death, is a good thing to have for your family, or do you think that you shouldn't do life insurance at all?
Well, so I think the insurance model itself is broken. Selling fear is a horrible, horrible, horrible construct. And no matter what you're selling the agency around that story on, I have a problem with any story that relies on fear as its primary motivator. So the idea of life insurance as we currently have it is this facade of being responsible. Obviously part of your, just good order and discipline is to make sure you're responsible. But it turns out that if you actually deposited your premiums in, an investment, you'd actually achieve the same thing, aligned to your life.
Right.
The reason why we have extraordinarily large life insurance policies is because we're not living at human scale.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you might think that you need a $500,000 policy or $1 million policy because you've decided that your lifestyle can only be achieved with a certain number of bedrooms in houses and number of cars in the garage and the brand of the car in the garage and everything else. What we've done is we've trapped ourselves in an illusion that says our identity is linked to having excessive physical manifestations of what we call our identity or our wealth. And then we enter into contracts to ensure the rightness of a wrong decision. See, if we sold life insurance this way, we wouldn't sell as much. Because if we actually said, do we need it? Well, the answer is no, we don't need it. If we lived at the scale of consciousness, if we lived at the scale of humanity. But if we don't do it, then what we've done is we've bought into a narrative that says, but I need to have these extra houses, I need to have these extra cars, I need to have all this excess debt. And in that world, I need the lottery ticket that says, and if I kick off early, I need somebody else to pay for my terrible judgments in life. Like I said, this would not be, New York Life sales pitch.
Right.
For a very good reason. Because if we actually told the truth, what we'd see is that it is in fact the manufacturing of mortgages, the manufacturing of collateralized debt obligations, the manufacturing of long-dated assets, which are your enslavement to a system, which are the very things that are the investments that fuel the life insurance company, because that's what they buy. And then you pay for the thing that you're indentured to. This is the most genius system in the universe. I'm going to enslave you, and then I'm going to have you pay for the management of your shackles.
Well, the enslavement part of this is kind of the punchline, right? I mean, and that's what most people, and I think that's the grand illusion, right? Is that I try to have my younger son understand, actually all my kids, but when I was explaining to him about the debt that's constantly racked up and the way the game is rigged, I'm saying, your children, your children's children, they are born into debt, which means they're enslaved.
Yes.
Just because they're born into this country.
Yeah.
And in that enslavement, here's how it works. So basically, they gave me a credit card and said, live your whole life on this credit, and after you die, they got to pay it off.
Right.
And everybody keeps passing that down, and we're almost driven to it by the societal norms that you outlined.
Right.
And it's kind of boiled frog. I mean, they've been there for so long, nobody really sees them anymore, right?
But this is the reason why I challenge anybody who tells me they're awake. Right? COVID supposedly woke people up. I've yet to meet an awakened person. They don't understand that COVID was a speed bump in your dream state. It actually wasn't an awakening moment for most people.
Right.
Because most people actually think that it was about masking and distancing and public health and the Wuhan whatever. That's what they think it was. And the great news is they got themselves wrapped around an axle on, I want to protest this and I don't want that, and down with this mandate, down with that mandate. And actually the tragedy is when it's over, they're going to think they won.
Yeah.
except for the fact that they'll be as wrong then as they were in 2008 when we actually thought that mortgages were this agency of responsibility. But in 2001, we forgot when George Bush said, hey, the American patriotic thing to do after 9/11 is to go out and buy. So what did he do? He liberalized the way you can turn your house into an ATM and take money back out to build more mortgages. And the beneficiary of that was who? Well, that's right. You actually re-levered the equity in your house so that you can pay interest to the bank. If you actually knew that your second mortgage was actually not a liquidity moment for you.
Right.
Your second mortgage was a lifetime indenture to take you out of the possibility of integrity and autonomy and reconnect you to the umbilical cord that you are to the bank that feeds the bank its nourishment while it's exsanguinating you. Once again, a very unpopular thing to say, but it's inconveniently exactly what we did.
Well, yeah.
And then people then say, well, I feel trapped in the system. No kidding.
Yeah.
Your umbilicus is linked to the nourishing, lovely offspring that you want to see, which is a more powerful banking system. Well done.
And when the banks start to get into trouble, we bail them out.
Yeah, with our taxpayer dollars.
In 2008, that's
Yep.
what we saw, the too big to fail phenomenon, that now their irresponsibility we're paying for.
Yeah, and this is the story. So that's why I find it fascinating when people kind of sit there and nostalgically go, well, I would like to go back, like make America great again. I did a speech recently in Utah where I made the simple observation that if we go from 1780 to 1880, that nostalgic period when we were destabilizing most of the First Nations peoples here, where we were taking immigrants from sweatshops across Europe and putting them into sweatshops in New York and Boston. I'm not sure which period of the 1780 to 1880 we're nostalgically hoping for. I'm not sure which nostalgic phase of 1904 to 1913 when we actually had the Peugeot Committee and the other investigations, the Armstrong Commission, looking into the fact that the Millionaires Congress had actually bought the democracy out from under the people. And we, the people, back then stood up and we had real investigations and real committee hearings. And we actually had cover stories that said, yes, in fact, the American dream had been purchased and hijacked and taken over. I'm not sure which nostalgic era people want to go back to. World War I, that was fun. How about the Dust Bowl and syphilis and the mandatory use of this tiny little new invention called penicillin so that we could actually get now methyl resistant and all kinds of other plague resistant bacteria that now you die of when you go to a hospital. Wow. Those kinds of fun days. Do you want to go back there? Where do we want to go back? And the problem is we don't tell the story of who we are. And that's why I find it fascinating when people talk about prepping for a future. Because it turns out that if we don't do some repentance inside ourselves, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be American? I'm not sure that I want to live with a giant stockpile of rice and beans in a world of ignorant people who think that the problem was what happened in 2028. Because it turns out that I want to actually work on building a genuinely thoughtful conversation now about a country we would like to build now. And actually start building the alternatives now so that when we get to 2028...
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, the incumbency falls over on its face. But guess what? We've figured out networks of exchange and of value and community that are actually quite robust. And when all of those things are failing, people go, I'll have what they're having. And actually rise with the tide of goodness rather than sink on the tsunami outflow of the crushing weight of 2028.
So how does that happen? What are the vehicles? Because first of all, very few people are going to have the understanding or even the context that you just described. But maybe, it's an Atlas Shrugged moment. Atlantis is born of people who think, and exchange and have that vision that you just described. But right now we have, we're still in COVID, to whatever degree, that is,
whatever that is.
Whatever that is. We've got Russia invading, Ukraine and saber rattling about nukes. 2028 coming, it's within the headlights of the car we're driving. I mean, all this stuff is happening right now. And it's so, I think there's communities of people, I mean, that we know just through the work we've been doing in this series that are getting together and saying, we're going to not have reliance on our government. We're going to we're going to kind of have a conscious community of people that are going to be self-reliant and have the distrust of political leaders, banking, etc.
That's what I'm talking about.
Are there vehicles like, for example,
time to go
right now, right? Who can trust their 401k? You already laid out, that as far as saying this is going to be the financial apparatus is literally disintegrating in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
The value of the dollar, will it even be the reserve currency for how many more years? Who knows? And what kind of disasters might that bring? So, do you buy gold? Do you buy silver? Are you putting money into crypto? What are the alternatives at this point?
I'm a big fan of asking a very simple question, and the question is, do you have a shit portfolio?
Shit.
Yeah.
Go ahead. What does shit stand for?
Well, that stands for the thing that comes out your butt.
Oh, it's not an acronym for something?
Nope.
Okay.
Now, let me unpack this for you.
Good.
Civilization is based on hygiene and sanitation.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't have that, we actually don't have civilization. One can make a fairly compelling argument historically that one of the reasons why we call the Fertile Crescent, the Tigris and Euphrates region, the region where Babylon once was, part of the reason why we think of that as the agency of where civilization emerged is because there was ample running water to facilitate hygiene. Now that doesn't mean that's where people were. People were all over the place. But civilization happens when you can live in closer proximity and not die from, kind of the effluent-borne diseases. And so it turns out that when I literally say, what do you have in your, if your portfolio doesn't have some shit in it, we got a problem. What I mean is that a good investment is to make sure that you think about what life is, and then think about what civilization is, and think about the fact that the convergence of those two questions mean that you should always have within your portfolio. And that means in your own preparation, in your own living environment, but also in your own preparation in terms of your financial participation. You should have sanitation as a bedrock of every portfolio. And that means your own and civil society sanitation. Right above that, and the Romans figured this out for 1,000 years, you need to have water. And you need to make sure that you have water in your portfolio. What does that mean? That means access to water. That means getting people together and buying headwaters of springs on continental divides. Why on continental divides? Well, because an artesian spring on a continental divide can't have stuff flowing into it. And that's a real key point. So if you really want resilience, you want to make sure the water that's coming out of the ground can't have things contaminating it. It's a crazy, phenomenal, once again, wizardry of Dave Martin. Look at the topography of where you live. Find land that has water coming out of high points. Buy that land. Because literally, in your portfolio, if you have sanitation and water, you've already hit 50% survival, which is an amazing thing to do. And then on top of that, food security, which is very simple. People who think that you can put enough in your basement to get through whatever you think is coming actually forget that it's the germinal foods, not the reserve foods that we have dried, stored in boxes. It's the ability to actually go through at least 2 to 3 growing cycles. Why 2 or 3? Because if we look across the long arc of history, the average, what I would call social decay phase, the extreme, harsh, that phase where everybody's kind of waiting for the zombie apocalypse, is 2 to 3 growing seasons, which means make sure you have the ability to have a germinal reserve, not a physical reserve.
And have the land to be able to grow.
Well, the land, or figure out how to take vertical gardens into your houses. How do you reconfigure southern facing houses? How do you look at the house that you're in and say, hey, did I buy the right view? And the right view is answered very simply. Windows on the south side, if you're in the northern hemisphere. Windows on the north side if you're in the southern hemisphere. Think very simple things. But what you see, Patrick, is what I'm doing is I'm actually saying, let's start with what would living look like? And then on top of what living looks like, how do we link ourselves to civility and civil society functioning, which is sanitation and water? How do we make sure that we have nutrition? And then on top of that, we can start talking about interesting things like, hey, what if we actually have excess resources after that? Well, let's get into consumable materials. Let's get into commodities like consumable metals, aluminum, energy supplies, a whole bunch of other things. How do we get into tungstens and the titaniums and other things that go into platinum and palladium, the other things that go into manufacturing pieces? Because as we build on top of our portfolio, the more we're linked to productivity, the more sustainable our portfolio is. And so I always joke with people, if you don't have shit in your portfolio, you have a shit portfolio. and I say that playfully, but it's actually dead to rights true.
Yeah.
If you have not figured out how to make sure your capacity to stay hygienic is somehow in your calculus, and if you haven't figured out how to make sure your surrounding environment is equally hygienic, because a cholera outbreak that's happening in all of your neighbors will happen to you. So solving this for you is not solving it. Solving it needs to be done on a scale that actually allows you to say, I've taken care of a bigger picture.
So high density population centers are,
move out.
Problematic, right? Move out.
Move out.
Yeah, you just can't. Like, if you're in the middle of New York City, Chicago,
move out.
It's kind of unsustainable. I mean, do you see with what's coming? I mean, are we going to see riots? Are we going to see?
Yes.
Okay, so the zombie apocalypse in essence. So, there's a financial collapse. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be without food and water.
Yeah.
Kind of soon after that.
Yeah.
Is it worldwide?
Yeah. Because the cool thing about this whole problem is we've built a system globally that is so interlocking and so interdependent that we probably will see large-scale civil unrest because Europe crowded its populations into urban density worse in many respects than the United States did. They had less land mass to work with, therefore they increased urban density. So you're going to see a lot of problems with just economic upheaval leading to social upheaval. And you see that, by the way. I mean, remember with Katrina. When Katrina hit New Orleans, we were less than 36 hours before people were bringing guns to gas stations.
Well,
I mean,
that's true. I remember this now.
It's
Yeah.
shocking.
Remember
Right?
black people?
That's not a very long bet on humanity, right? If we're willing to shoot over a gas station, we'll shoot over a lot of other things too. So the social fabric is so stretched right now and so loaded and charged with conflict that if we had the ability to have a single event horizon where suddenly we can't fill up our gas tanks, we can't go to the grocery store, we can't do whatever we plan on doing, we have a very fragile system. The plastic level of that system is to the bent to breaking point. And so we really do have a problem. What that tells us is that the opportunity now is to actually start solving for that problem now, which is how do we take the areas that are perimeters of cities and start amplifying the organic production values of those? How do we take what used to be suburbs that were subdivisions that were actually once upon a time farms or fields or whatever else? How about we actually stop building urban density right next to cities and actually put agriculture next to cities so that what we have is a world in which we've actually thought through how we go about building out a more resilient future. These are all things that we can do between now and 2028. They're not impossible. Everything I'm talking about has the advantage of having an event horizon that is far enough out that we can actually prepare for it.
So what matters here is the fact that you have people who are don't have the power or the influence.
Yeah.
The citizenry, basically. And right now, they can be listening to us and say, okay, I got a date 2028, and I've got to start thinking about what to do. And they have time to prepare. But between now and 2028, if you happen to be Ukrainian, and maybe happen to be in the next conflict, things can happen real fast. In other words, I guess what I'm asserting is this. It is not a relaxing thought to say I've got 6 years to prepare. Because it might be, if you happen to live in the wrong place at the wrong time and circumstances that are well beyond your control, it might be tomorrow.
Absolutely. And I think part of the value of this conversation for me, Patrick, is to realize that one of the mistakes that we can make is we can prepare for some sort of deep disruptive event. And to a certain degree, there is an instant survival moment where I think it's plausible to say that we could actually plan for some sort of survival. I think where I come out on this is I actually want a great country. I want a place where my children, and now I'm soon to be a grandfather, so my grandchildren, I want to have a world in which those individuals have the opportunity to grow and flourish in a community, not in a bunker. And so I think part of the reason why I keep coming back to this is we're allowing the theater of the moment to distract us from the structural things we're not paying attention to. And what I try to do is bring people back to saying, if we have a bunch of survivalists who never understood the systems that got us to where we are, then what we will do very predictably, and by the way, humanity has about an 8,000-year track record so far in publication on this one, so the reason why I'm pretty long this is because it's the only evidence we have. Humanity has done a great job of replicating broken systems and putting a new theater face on the front and then pretending that something's new. And the reason why we're having this conversation is I don't want to survive with people who are going to replicate the same start of the same broken system. And we are only going to have a true resilient society when we have the ability to sit back, as we do right now, and reflect on, oh, hold on a minute. So this idea of building 420 years of economies based on drug dealing sounds like a bad idea. Yes, it is a bad idea. Let's not put that into our bunker. Oh, the idea of building an economic system based on debt-based denominated bets, where we have mortgages and we have life insurance as a primary driver of our society. Hey, that's not one that we want to take into the bunker. Having a world in which we rely on industrial pharmaceuticals rather than having nutrition and nourishment and vitality and exercise and spiritual connection and everything else, let's not take that into the bunker, because the problem is the same jerk that goes into the bunker and eats jerky and rice and beans is going to be the same jerk that comes out of the bunker, only slightly more famished and a little more pissed off. And the bad thing about that is I don't want any world where we simply have the wisdom of the experience we've lived through, where we don't integrate that and say, as important as what you put into Tupperware is the intellect that you put between your ears. Because if you don't do both, you may organically survive, but you may come out into a world that is dark and as hopeless as the world you left.
Is the world that we're in right now redeemable, or do you think it has to collapse and then be rebuilt by people who are at the frequency you're describing as far as their consciousness?
Well, the good news is I'm actually currently very actively involved in building next.
What's next?
Well, next is figuring out new ways to emancipate energy from places that people said you couldn't get energy before. Whether that be tar sands, whether that be solar, whether that be wind or water, a bunch of other things. We're doing a lot of projects which are specifically to emancipate energy in new ways so that we actually have an ability to make our systems vital before we have a central grid collapse. So we're doing that, and I'm working on that right now. We're working on alternative currencies. So I have worked with countries all over the world to use their bankable reserves as actually reserve assets for currencies. While everybody else is doing, Bitcoin mining and crypto and everything else, I'm actually trying to aggregate physical resources that say we have $60 billion of gold or copper or titanium or whatever else, and have those assets in trust so that we can actually have a grounded reality that says that if an electrical grid goes down, if a power system fails, if a telecommunication system fails, if, God forbid, we have an EMP and we take out all electronics, do we still have something of value? When my e-wallet melts from an EMP, do I have a gold mine? And if the answer is no, then I haven't solved my problem.
Right.
So what I'm doing is I'm actually looking at a fundamental view of the world and saying, hey, I've got an idea. I want to make sure I have what I have right now, which is I have a vertical flow contamination facility so that if I ever need to have my own sanitation, I have a 20-meter sanitation process that actually gets clean water at the end of it. I already have that. Why? Because I eat my own dog food. If I say it's a good idea, then I think it's a good idea. I have 4 artesian springs at the top of a hill. Why? Because I think having water is a doggone good idea. These are all things that I'm not advocating in an abstract. I'm actually putting into practice now. And every one of those things has capacity well beyond my needs, my family's needs, my immediate community's needs. These are things that are part of a big coherent system. And now I'm working on putting together a bunch of groups of people where we're building these networks across the country and around the world. So the good news is we're actually building the future before we need it.
Yeah.
And the greatest part about that is I'd rather do that than find the hole which I can dig into and hope that, you know, when the bombs stop flying, I can open the hatch and come out and go, well, at least I made it. I don't want to live in a world that only has me in it. That's a terrifying thought. I'm okay that I'm here, but I wouldn't want to be the only here. I like the plurality of my experience with other people, and I want to make sure that I have as many people standing at the end when the beginning starts.
So this is solved, I think, on the community level, you know, for the most part, is that, you know, central planning and big governments don't work.
Yeah.
It's you got to push it all the way down to the people who live with each other in a given geographic region.
Yeah, you know, there's a bunch of studies that have examined what style of government is capable of functioning. And there's a bunch of really beautiful academic work on the question, can you have a democracy of 400 million people? Is it even physically possible? And some rather compelling arguments to say, at the local level, democracy is a really good idea. And local might mean your city, your county, maybe a region within your state, but where you have enough similar experience of life, your daily experience of life is kind of working. Having democracies there is actually probably a pretty good idea. Once you get to the size of a state, democracies start getting slightly problematic. And that's because different parts of regions of that area may have radically different resources, radically different social needs, radically different other things. And at some point you need an autocrat to go, I'm going to take from you and I'm going to apportion here, simply because the imbalances that are natural and geographic and everything else actually are real. That's not, by the way, a democracy. That's an autocracy.
Right.
That's somebody saying should. And then somewhere above that, there probably is something that is remarkably necessary to operate in nearly dictatorial fashion, which is probably where the notion of nation-state security. You know, would we want to have a world in which every time we needed to defend ourselves, we had to have a groupthink? Well, no. If the bombs are flying, I want somebody who is confident in going, take action now. I don't want a committee at that moment. And so the question is, where do we have what system of government? But the most important piece of that conversation is the one that has the most instantaneous, broad-scale effect should have the least ability to influence the day-to-day decisions.
Right.
Their executive function should be, hey, we care about defending the country. I'm good with that. We care about having basic rules of fair trade. I'm good with that. And after that, you're out of every other decision.
Well, wasn't that the original idea?
Well, I'm nostalgically talking about exactly what we said we were going to create.
Right. I mean, and that's the whole idea. It's a, you know, you could look at democracy as mob rule. You know, it's just the biggest mob rules.
Yeah.
But when you have unalienable individual rights that are guaranteed, the mob can't violate that.
Correct.
And then, you know, so what's the function of a government then at that point? To protect rights, right?
Right.
Intellectual property rights, real property rights, you know, foreign invaders, local police force, etc., and then get out of the way and let people live. Right?
Yeah, and what we've had over the last, particularly, certainly, let's call it the last 90 years, because it really is. From 1930 forward, we have not had a shred of democracy in this country. But if we look at it, that's when we decided to make everybody beholden to the parent figure called the federal government.
Right.
So we relied on the government for banking and for monetary systems and for insurance and for food security and health security and all of the kinds of things that we have, and plus the roads and infrastructure and businesses and so forth. Well, that was never the role of federal government.
No.
And we allowed that mission creep to come to the place where now we turn to the federal government for everything, and that is our fault. And we, the people, have to take responsibility for that and then take back our ability to move forward. But once again, the value of this conversation is coming back to the very simple question of, do you want to have the man in the mirror crawling out of the bunker? Because if we haven't had the right conversation about what our social order is, then preservation of the organic function of human life is very much secondary to do we want a quality of living or do we want to survive? And I live on the quality of living side of that conversation, not on the survival side.
So I think, in summary, get out of a population center, dense population centers, those are going to be problematic, no doubt. I mean, even if you happen to be a Ukrainian right now, if you're in the countryside with the means to live, you probably are, okay. If you are in the middle of one of these cities that's getting shelled, you're not okay.
Yeah.
And then secondly, look past it at that point, saying, if I've got that covered, how do we not repeat this? And you and I, have that disposition of saying there's a consciousness around this that's not just about saying survive at any cost. Some things are worse than death.
Yeah.
So the idea is saying that I think we're irretrievable at this point. I don't see that we could suddenly fix this. All the forces that are at play, it's reaching its fever pitch. I don't know. 2028. You say that is really the destiny, the point in the future where it all comes home to roost in a sense.
Yeah.
And I think you make a very compelling argument for that. Something could happen sooner. Maybe it lasts past that. Who knows? But let's just say that I think everybody can agree. I don't know that this can get fixed.
Well, so this, if we describe the last 70 years, is irreparable. A world in which we, the people, surrogate to a federal government our ability to control our destiny, our ability to exercise our rights and liberties, our ability to have financial, physical, and bodily autonomy. If we, the people, actually look at that system is broken to the point of no repair.
Right.
But humanity, and I would go as far as to say America, is not broken to the point of no repair. We do have the capacity, and that is the reason why I'm doing everything I'm doing every day of my life. We do have the ability to engage in thoughtful dialogue about the future that we want to manifest, and then work today to start manifesting it. This is one of the very few times in human history that we have the ability to have a horizon. Most of the time, we've had to deal with this in crisis mode. The fact is, we are not hopeless. We're not a turtle, laying upside down, going, what do we do? We have the ability to do the right thing, and I am certain that conversations like this will at least have a few people step back, take a pause, and say, hey, there is a better world, and that better world exists now if we manifest it now. And so I'm as hopeful as a human being possibly can be, because I'm certain of the fact that I'm doing what I'm doing, and I know that what I'm doing is one person's effort. And if by this conversation, or one like it, we amplify that by 2 or 4 or 10 or 1,000 or 10,000, all the better.
Yeah.
Because if we have 10,000 people working on these issues, guess what? We're not counting on this crazy brain, and that would be a good thing. Because I don't want to be alone in my bunker either. I want to be hanging out with other people.
Right on. Well, David, this has been extremely insightful, stimulating to say the least, and I believe that somebody who is listening to what you have to say and processing it can actually turn into something very fruitful for not only themselves and their families, but for society in general. So I do appreciate the work that you're doing, and I'm rooting for you all the way.
Very good. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Well, that concludes my interview with Dr. David Martin.